Hello, I am the son who, overnight, became my mother's legal husband after registering our marriage. I understand that this decision might seem strange to some, but at the time, I believed it was the best choice for both of us. Marrying my mother was a decision influenced by the adversities I faced in life, and the extreme pain we shared seemed inevitable. However, this misguided union left deep scars and wounds that are difficult to heal. Therefore, we had no choice but to seek an annulment of the marriage. My childhood was marked by a series of changes and instability. I was raised in orphanages across the country, constantly moving and living with foster parents for a period. When my biological parents discovered that I had a genetic disease affecting my mobility, they cruelly abandoned me. Since then, my life has been a constant challenge, characterized by the coldness and uncertainty of an unstable fate. In the orphanage, everyone I met was merely a transient connection. The constant change and adaptation became an unbearable burden, especially because, due to my condition, I relied on a wheelchair and could not attend school. I was often the target of scorn and ignored by other children. However, my life changed dramatically when I was 13 and met a volunteer who seemed like a sign of destiny. She, who had dreamed of becoming a nun, stood out from the other volunteers. From the beginning, she visited the orphanage regularly, offering kind words and doing simple activities with us. She showed special care for me, and gradually, I began to accept this attention. Her warm and affectionate demeanor made her more than just a volunteer to me. She became family. I called her Mom, and she became my safe haven, offering me all the love I needed and encouraging me to keep going, even during the worst times. When I reached the age to leave the orphanage, I felt completely lost. I didn't know where to go, how to support myself, or how to face life with my weakened body. Without a family and with an uncertain future, I found myself in a desperate situation. It was then that the person who became my true mother offered me shelter. With a gentle voice, she said, "Young Hoon, if you don't have a good place to go, why don't you come live with me?" She spoke with such sincerity and concern, and I knew that despite the difficulties, she was willing to help me. She reassured me, saying that despite any discomfort, I was not a burden to her and that she would care for me as if I were her own child. Her offer of support and love gave me strength and hope amid my financial struggles and difficulties. Thus, our lives became deeply intertwined, and her love became the greatest source of strength I have ever known. Over time, my mother and I faced real difficulties. She had to cut her work in half to take care of me due to my physical disability, and the situation started to become increasingly complicated. I tried to save as much as I could, but utility bills, food, and other expenses were still very high. Life became more and more difficult, and the affection my mother used to show seemed to have disappeared. She was probably uncomfortable with the idea of sending me away, so she decided that we should continue living together, ignoring the challenges she was facing. There were many moments when we hurt each other, and my mother's daily habit of taking out her frustration on me by yelling became common. At first, she would only have 1 or 2 drinks, but soon this turned into a frequent habit. Bottles of alcohol accumulated, and her face was always marked by deep sadness. I considered leaving home, but the fear of being alone again kept me from doing so. I felt trapped and unable to help my mother in any way. Then, she made a shocking suggestion. "This month's gas bill is 200,000 won. That's because we kept the heating on while I had the flu last month. Honestly, our resources aren't enough to support both of us. I'm sorry. What should I do? I wish I could do something to help, and if you're willing to do anything, maybe you could consider registering our marriage. I'm not saying I'll be attractive, so don't be surprised." My mother's proposal was absurd, but she explained that if I registered as her legal spouse, she could handle all the legal matters without having to worry about the community center and paperwork. She recalled a recent incident when I twisted my back on the icy road while helping her and expressed her regret for not being able to offer more. She believed that by registering our marriage, benefits would increase and the situation would improve, unlike seeking adoption, which would involve a more complicated process. My mother knew it was a painful proposal, but it was the most practical solution at the time. She asked me to consider the idea and make a decision, The thought of marrying for financial reasons with no love involved left me confused. I felt like I was doing something illegal and hesitated to share my doubts with my mother. I also feared the possibility of meeting someone in the future and wanting to marry for love, which would make the situation even more complicated. The decision was difficult, and options were limited since we lived in a remote place. I needed to carefully weigh what to do and give my mother an answer as soon as possible. I felt completely powerless. With my hands and feet debilitated, I couldn't find a job or generate income immediately. Given our situation, I considered that the solution might lie in the restrictions imposed by my mother. That's how, overnight, we became an official couple. From that moment on, my mother had to quit her job to maximize the available benefits, leaving her occasional job as a kitchen helper completely. She rushed to the welfare center and applied for all possible assistance. This gave us temporary relief from the financial difficulties we were facing. However, contrary to what I expected, most of the subsidies received were used to support my mother's alcohol addiction. She had already been struggling with this problem, and over time, she became even more dependent on alcohol, spending many days in silence and withdrawn. Meanwhile, my mother took full control of the finances. I needed her permission for everything, and she was the one who made all the payments. Talking about any desire or need became a challenge, as any suggestion I made was quickly silenced. Additionally, my mother, who had promised never to get involved with another man, began dating a dark-skinned man. They met frequently in the evenings, and soon the man was constantly in our home. The sudden change in my mother's behavior was hard to accept, and inexplicably, I felt increasingly alienated and isolated. One night, we had a big argument when she came home completely drunk. "Young Hoon, I'm home," she said. "Mom, you've been gone for a long time and you're still very drunk. We only had a sip of soju and you got so drunk that you didn't contact us for 3 days. I didn't return your calls because your phone was off again. What were you doing? Why doesn't your phone have any battery?" My mother responded with frustration. "I have some friends, and besides, my phone is old. I can't keep the battery charged. It's not that I don't want to, but I need a new phone. What happened to the one you bought 3 months ago? Is it already broken? It seemed like you were ignoring my calls on purpose." The atmosphere at home was tense, and my mother became irritated by small things, like the food. "I don't have the energy to cook. Why don't you mix a little pepper paste or soybean paste with the rice? Complaining about side dishes is a joke. From now on, I'll spend half of the subsidy myself. I'm tired of having to ask for permission for every expense. It's driving me crazy. And how can you trust me with the money if you're so young? I'm an adult too, and I can't keep carrying everything for that gaming-addicted boyfriend." The situation was becoming unsustainable, and the weight of responsibilities and tensions at home was deeply affecting our relationship. "Just because you gave me something doesn't mean you can simply ignore me. Don't you have the right to say anything to your mother? And what about that guy who's just a friend? If you're spending money, at least show me where it's going. If you pay the rent and find a place to live, there won't be anything left. Your mother will end up taking it all. I know you get support for rent and the gas bill, but if things keep going this way, I won't be able to live with my mother anymore. I researched online and found that even if I'm in debt to my mother, there are places that can offer help. As expected, the help I sought wasn't enough. I thought about all the sacrifices I made for you, and now you're even threatening to leave home. I also made sacrifices for my mother and don't understand why you don't recognize that. If that's the case, why did you take me away? The same old behavior, and of course, it's not right for me. As a mother, I don't think it's right to manage our money this way. Tell me, why can't you just leave my house immediately? Even if it's not me, there are many other people who can help you. Your despicable behavior makes me believe that I can't live with someone who doesn't recognize how much I've been through. If you think it's uncomfortable, please reveal my role. I'm tired of being suspected without reason and want to resolve the family registration immediately. My mother wasn't like this before, but she changed. I've already said I can't stay married to you if you're going to keep causing problems and making noise. Leave my house now." Suddenly, my mother became furious and kicked me out. With a wheelchair and no money, I had nowhere to go. As I wandered through the snow-covered streets, I couldn't hold back the tears as I reflected on the mistakes I made by deciding to live with my mother. I carried my phone, feeling miserable and alone in the world. I wandered aimlessly, looking for a place to lie down. In the dead of winter and after days of not eating properly, my body started to weaken. I shivered and eventually collapsed in the street. When I regained consciousness, I woke up in a warm bed in a hospital. The tremor in my heart didn't easily subside, even after treatment. After recovering, I sought help at a shelter for people with disabilities. Looking back at my desperate situation, I wondered how I could recover. It was hard to believe that the relationship with my mother, which had lasted nearly half my life, had deteriorated so much. The memories now seemed like a distant past. Due to my mother's actions, I suffered greatly. Although I was hurt, I decided not to rely on anyone else and to take responsibility for my own life. The support I received at the shelter helped me take steps to move forward. I then decided to file for an annulment to legally dissolve the marriage with my mother. This was the first big step toward a new beginning in my life. It was a difficult decision, but my mother called me every day, insisting that I reconsider. "It's your mother," she would say. "Yes, you called again. Why are you doing this to your mother? You left home that day." She claimed that I had been expelled, when, in fact, it wasn't my decision to leave. That day, my mother was so drunk that we couldn't even discuss dropping the annulment process and going back to her house as if nothing had happened. She kept insisting that we should live together again. However, I was deeply hurt and disappointed. The pain and loneliness I felt from being alone were unbearable. Now, my desire was to live my life independently, without relying on anyone. So, despite the difficulties, I asked her to support me from a distance. I understood that the situation was uncomfortable for both of us, but I needed to free myself from this complicated relationship with my mother and start over. I had given up everything for her, but now I felt betrayed. Was everything revolving around money? The feeling of betrayal was overwhelming. I had made a promise to the Lord to take responsibility for my mother, but I felt that I could no longer keep that promise, as my life and soul were at stake. "You need to rest," I said. "If you keep talking like this, I'm going to hang up." I needed space to breathe. My mother's strange and harmful obsession had been a huge mental burden for me. Although I had been deeply influenced by her, I managed to take legal steps to block her number and initiate the annulment process. Despite the difficulties, I knew that my case was an exception, and eventually the court recognized it as an unjust marriage. The process was exhausting and an enormous emotional weight, an experience I never wanted to go through again. The relief I felt when I finally completed the process was indescribable. I could finally take control of my own life and become the protagonist of my story. With renewed confidence, I began to plan a new life. Now, as a legally free person, I was ready to start over independently. I entered a vocational rehabilitation center and began studying accounting. I wanted to work in a place where my skills were valued and where I could develop my life on my own. I would no longer rely on anyone but would take firm steps toward a better future.